All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Center for Biological Diversity's webinar, Best Practices for Plant-Based City Food Policy. I'd like to start with a quick introduction and some housekeeping before we dive into our panel. The chat is disabled, so please use our Q&A feature to submit your questions as they arise throughout the webinar, and we'll seek to answer them at the end. This webinar is also being recorded, and the video will be made publicly available afterward. My name is Leah Kelly, and I'm a food and agriculture policy specialist in the Center's Population and Sustainability Program. As part of our mission to protect wild species and places, we work to build a just and sustainable plant-forward food system that reduces humanity's burden on the planet and its resources. One aspect of this includes working with other organizations and local governments to pass and implement policies that promote more plant-centered diets that produce fewer GHGs and consume fewer resources. Next slide, please. So here's our agenda. The purpose of this webinar is to gather expertise from several leaders who are currently driving plant-based food policies at the city and municipal level, with a particular emphasis on how to work with and within city governments. Such policies include, for example, default veg policies, which make all city-sponsored events serve plant-based meals by default, and food procurement policies, which set standards for the types of food cities can purchase and serve. My hope is that we can generate some useful best practices to implement moving forward. I want to note that since this webinar is about the how and not the why, I won't go any deeper into the reasons why we're working so hard to implement plant-based food policies in cities around the country. However, you can find many resources that explain the why, such as on the center's website, takeextinctionoffyourplate.com, on the screen there, and the websites of all of the panelists' organizations featured here today. Now, I'm excited to introduce our 4 panelists, each of whom has done incredible work at the local level. By my count, over the past 5 years, they have collectively helped to successfully pass at least a dozen different plant-based policies across many different localities nationwide, which you can see on the timeline here, and are currently working on dozens more initiatives. First, Britty Mann is the Executive Director of Planted Society, a nonprofit which works with cities and local organizers to implement the Eat for Impact initiative. Then we have Alex Cerussi, who's the Senior State Policy Manager at Mercy for Animals and oversees the organization's state and local policy initiatives related to food system reform. And then we have Lee Cascada, who is Senior Director of Campaigns at the Better Food Foundation, where she's worked with cities nationwide to shift to more sustainable plant-forward food. And finally, Rachel Atcheson is the Executive Director of Food Policy Pathways after serving 8 years in city government in New York City. I will ask each panelist questions related to each of the topic areas listed in the agenda, and then we'll have time at the end for our audience Q&A, so remember to ask your questions using the Q&A function at the center bottom of your screen. Our first topic is launching a city initiative. I want to start by recognizing the need for strong municipal food policies in the first place and why they're important. Therefore, Britty, for those who might be unfamiliar, can you briefly explain why cities are important vehicles for change and what power they have to make a significant impact through food policy?
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here. First of all, wonderful job, Leah, getting this all organized. And I hear there are a lot of people watching this, so I really appreciate all the work you do and all the work of our fellow panelists as well. So just to start with, great job. I think cities are incredibly important to us, especially at Planted Society, because it's where change actually touches people's lives the most, even though I think a lot of us don't really realize it. I think I speak for more than myself when I say that I wake up every morning and tune into the news and see what's happening at the federal level, and it feels really big. And that's because it is. But also, I think we often forget how close we are to city policy as residents and as people who work with cities. So I think that they're one of the biggest change makers that we could possibly be working with. Subnational policy is going to be really, really important. It has been, and it will continue to be probably more important in the next few years. And so I do think that they're a really, really important partner to think about at organizations and even as residents of cities. So I think that depending on the city where you live, you might even know city council members, you might go to town halls. And so I think that the fact that cities can issue policy that affects people so immediately is it can be really great. It can also be really bad if it's implemented poorly. But the cool thing about it, I think, is that it could change really quickly. So cities are able to pivot very fast. They're able to see what each other are doing. They're able to see, I don't know if that was the right way to say that sentence, but they're able to see what other cities are doing and able to see what works and what doesn't. And they can change policy pretty quickly too. And I know it doesn't feel that way if you work inside of a city, but in the long game, you can pivot really fast as a city. So I think that they're a really great ally in that way to kind of test for other bigger cities, maybe what works at a policy level in a smaller city or vice versa. So anyway, I'm rambling, but I think that one of the cool things that I've noticed with our work is that the cities we work with are watching each other and helping each other and collaborating and competing in really great ways. And so I think that without getting too sappy, they are definitely who we should be looking at for real change that's happening at the community level. But I'm sure other people on the panel have much more better answers than I do, but I'm just a fan of working with city councils and mayors and offices of sustainability. So nothing but good things to say about cities.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear more about some of the specific work you've done with cities. For people who want to make change, be they city officials or regular citizens, it can be very difficult to know where to start. So at Planted Society, for example, Britty, you recently succeeded in getting the city of Austin to encourage plant-based food defaults in its citywide food plan. How do you go about approaching a city with your Eat for Impact initiative? And also, if you could explain a little bit what that looks like, what the initiative is, and then how do you tailor that initiative to each city to try to facilitate long-term policy change?
Okay. Yeah, well, first of all, I would love to take credit for Austin's new food policy. I will not. We are just an initiative. I'll explain what the initiative is. So, Eat for Impact was previously called Plant-Based for the Planet. In its previous iterations, we iterate the heck out of this initiative, not just from city to city, but as time has gone on, we've changed it. So basically, we will reach out to city council members, to offices of sustainability, climate offices, and just see if they want to take this on. And what this is a community initiative that kind of brings together the actions that are already being implemented at the city level. We bring in local nonprofits, local community organizations, and the big star of our initiatives are the restaurants that we work with. I hate to say that it is a restaurant initiative, but it definitely is what gets press. So that is definitely what people see on the outside. And it's a very, very big part of our initiative. So we will target cities, I suppose, based on which of our volunteers lives there and who wants to organize. There was a time when we would pick and choose based on, the size of the city and the location and what their policies are. We certainly do policy research. We have a giant database of policy, of city policy that we can pull from. Thanks to our organizers that kind of helps us start those conversations. But we definitely don't have the conversation like from the get-go of like, hey, we're coming in and we're going to change you. We really, really want to reflect what the city's values already are. So with Austin specifically, this is a really great example of how initiatives like this can inspire city policy and it also can follow city policy. So for us, we look at Austin, which was our first ever city partner, which they're amazing. They're one of the only city partners we have who actually sponsors our program with funds. And with them, we started when they were doing research on, getting this new food policy passed and also a new climate and food equity policy passed. Pardon me for probably jumbling those two things, but cities, they're working on several different things at once. And this has been years and years in the making. So one of the justifications for being able to have a plant-based food policy was that we already have initiatives like Eat for Impact happening in Austin. And then after it's passed, they have a justification to continue supporting initiatives like ours and other community initiatives that involve food and urban agriculture because this policy has now been passed. So it's all good. We come in at any point and kind of answer what the city needs and also are an answer to policy that they would like to pass. If that makes sense.
Thanks so much. Would you like to give any other specific examples or stories of how you specifically conducted outreach to and built partnerships with various cities?
Yeah, it's different every time. We usually start with someone who's already engaging in food policy. Some cities that we work with really, really tiny places. We've worked with a town called Moorestown in New Jersey, Moore. We've also worked with Morristown, New Jersey, not to be confused. Um, they had nothing, they don't have a climate policy, they don't have a food policy. And so when we work with them, we're really just reaching out, or when we reach out to them, I guess, we are really just asking for an endorsement. So this is kind of like going to lay the groundwork for potentially making some change in the city. And a lot of people might look in and go, like, that's, what kind of impact could you make there? But as soon as one city starts doing this, other cities, like I said, will look at and see how many others are doing it and have more of a grounds to be able to take action, be able to convince, city councilors and policymakers that there is a proof for this. We can actually accomplish it. So it really depends. Usually we reach out to them or a city councilor. Sometimes we approach nonprofits first because they have the links, but really what we're looking for is a very cohesive community strategy. Like we want everybody on board who has a stake in this, especially since this is a 1 month initiative. We are not there afterwards in a big capacity. So we're very interested in pulling in as many people as possible so that the work continues when we're gone.
Thank you, Brady. Moving on to our next topic, building support and working with cities. Alex, you've worked with many different city officials, particularly in Los Angeles County, to pass successful plant-based policies. Can you describe what it's like once you've introduced a policy to work to build that support and promote a policy for successful passage with a city?
Yeah, of course. So I look at it as there being two simultaneous strategies. So one is I'll call the stakeholder route, and the other is the legislator route, although of course legislators are a stakeholder, but separating them out for now. So before even pitching a policy, we focus significantly on coalition building and stakeholder engagement. And this ties, I think, well to some of what Britty just was talking about. So for when deciding whether or not to pursue a plant-based policy in the first place in a given jurisdiction, we'll perform a series of analyses to try and identify, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, a SWOT analysis or power mapping exercises to better understand who the relevant players are in relation to the policy issue at hand, and to identify the relationships between those key players and assess the relevance to our strategy. And as a result of doing these kinds of initial analyses, we wind up with a list of questions that we then, of course, set out to answer. So, for example, we consider, does a certain organization on the ground have a view about our issue, or are they already working in this space? What kind of relationship does an organization have with relevant decision makers, in this case, city officials? For those stakeholders, individuals, or organizations in a specific city, let's say, or a county, if they're not already supportive of a policy like this, is there anything we can do to help get them, move them to be more supportive? How can we work best together? And then, of course, how can we connect and organize the people who are directly impacted and the constituents who live in that city? Just like Britty was saying, it's so important to pursue something only if there is true desire and interest happening in that city, so that we're not coming in as outsiders. It's vital to work together with folks who are already there doing related work, or just advocates who want to see change and are looking for some support and some direction. And these questions, of course, some can be answered with online research, but most are answered by having direct conversations with community members on the ground and learning about the various relationships and the relevant stakeholders who we might be able to bring into the fold when pushing for a policy. So this stakeholder route and the legislator route is all about communication and trust building. So ideally, by the time a bill or policy is introduced, we'd already have a solid, coalition of organizations and constituents working together to advance a policy. But of course, it's never too late to grow and strengthen a coalition. And since we're specifically talking about plant-based food procurement policies, which I know we're not getting into the why today, but I will say they of course do benefit the climate, the environment, animals, and our health. We want to make sure that stakeholders, that the stakeholders we bring into the fold for a policy like this are representative of these different areas, since they are the experts and can add significant value to any policy campaign. So, I'll say then, like, going down through the legislative process or the policymaking process, when a date is finally set for a public hearing, we of course can help, invest time in helping prepare constituents who wish to testify, for example, in support of a plant-based policy. And I think this is, again, another important piece to the puzzle of successfully passing and then of course implementing a plant-based policy, ensuring that constituents who live in that city who are going to be directly impacted, feel comfortable enough to use their voices to advocate to their elected officials that they want to see something like this happen. So taking the time to meet virtually or in person ahead of a public hearing, prep them with talking points, answer questions, tell them what to expect. I think many of us know who have, your first time lobbying, or if you've engaged in the legislative process before, it can seem like a really intimidating process. For groups like ours who are working to advance these kinds of policies, I think it's in part our responsibility to, dissuade any kinds of concerns and make constituents feel comfortable so they can use their voice. And we know that the most important voices to hear at a public hearing or at any point really during the public policy making process is those of a constituent. So, and then the last thing I'll say, the legislator route, again, this is all happening in my opinion, simultaneously while we're working to build that public support, stakeholder engagement support, of course, is communicating with legislators. So, you had asked, like, after a bill has been introduced. So, I'd say, as a coalition and in coordination, of course, with our bill sponsor, taking direction from our bill sponsor, or whoever is championing our policy, we would make sincere effort to meet with, remaining legislators, basically just be a resource there to answer questions that they might have, take into account any suggestions or advice that they may have, really just to set us up for success so that when a bill or policy comes before the elected body for a vote, we've done our due diligence and hopefully have addressed any potential concerns that they may be, so we can see the policy succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like it's really important to have dedicated partners on the city side to get a policy passed. Like you said, the person who's going to introduce the bill and sort of be a champion along the way. And you did a great job of that in West Hollywood and LA. You were able to obtain strong sponsorship for your policies from elected city council members, the current mayor of West Hollywood, and county supervisors. So how do you, or what do you see as the key to building those trusting and lasting relationships with city officials?
So I love this question. And I hope this isn't too repetitive for most folks on the call, but you will know this if you have lobbied or if you've just done any form of lobbying or advocating for policy change. Lobbying and working with legislators is all about trust. So that's absolutely like the foundation, and it's vital to any kind of success. So, I mean, there's a handful of things. I'm sure this is not going to be an exhaustive list, but the first thing I recommend, when you're first pitching a policy to a lawmaker is, of course, coming prepared, which sounds very obvious. But I think it's really important to show that you are serious about this, that you know what you're talking about, and that you can be a strong, good, reliable partner in pushing a policy forward. So doing your research ahead of time to identify the policy priorities and common areas of interest with a legislator or staffer. As an animal protection organization working on food systems reform, it's essential that in my role, I come to a meeting, to be and able to be clear and succinct in explaining, why it is Mercy for Animals in this case is advocating for a plant-based procurement policy, and of course why it's beneficial for the city to engage and how we might be able to work together. Part of trust building with city officials is also, I think, going above and beyond what they expect of, or ask. So this is I think this is kind of a seemingly small example, but in my experience, it's gone a long way. So taking the time to create materials that are really helpful that maybe haven't been asked, and maybe especially at, I think, the city and county level are rarely asked for in my experience. So creating fact sheets, implementation guides, and even organizing like an organizational sign-on letter of support for a given policy are ways to show a city official, again, that you're committed to seeing this policy pass and be successful, and that you're serious about helping it be implemented and, again, successful even after it gets voted into law, for example. Couple more ideas. Another way is just to be comfortable admitting when you don't have an answer to something, when you're not the appropriate stakeholder to answer a question. And this ties back to how important it is to build coalitions, and specifically diverse coalitions, so that if I'm, for example, lobbying for a plant-based procurement policy, and I'm asked a very specific question about, the public health impacts of plant-based food or animal-based foods, I can, that's a great opportunity for me. Sure, I can answer it at a high level, but if I want to have the appropriate stakeholder, that might be, a coalition partner from a public health organization who I can kind of tap in or tag in to answer that in more depth. That creates trust, being able to be vulnerable and, while still maintaining the professionalism that you want to display, of course, when working with city officials. And I think I'll say the last thing is very simple, but just being a people person, being yourself. If you're lobbying or advocating for a policy like this, you're probably a passionate person, and you probably genuinely want to affect change. Of course, you always want to act professionally and you want to be respectful of one another's time, but I also think it's okay, and more than okay, I think it's important to make small talk and demonstrate sincere interest in, how they're doing, and show interest or even offer support for some of their other policy priorities. Do whatever you can to show that you are a person and you're invested in developing this professional working relationship.
Great, yeah. You touched on this a little bit, but just briefly, I was wondering, another important aspect of policy advocacy is working with other partners, such as on-the-ground supporters, movements, and other advocacy groups. I guess specifically in regard to movements and coalitions in cities, how do you leverage those when building support, and how do you make sure everyone is collaborating smoothly?
Yeah, I think you're right. I probably spoke to this mostly in that first question you asked about like stakeholder engagement and coalition building, but I guess I'll just add that with a plant-based procurement policy, so when we're asking to, we're trying to pass policy that would require, let's say, government to purchase more healthy plant-based foods and less animal-based foods as a way of reducing the climate impact of the food purchases. We should really consider the intersectionality of a policy like this, because, like I said, it touches on, the health sector, the climate environment. There are so many movements and relevant issues at play here. So I think, there's almost always an opportunity to, again, engage with other movements who might be, in a given city or a jurisdiction, who might not necessarily be pursuing this exact policy, but there's almost always an opportunity to connect the dots and collaborate and work to support one another's individual campaigns. So, we see this a lot with cities, especially now under the current administration, really moving to try and pass strong climate actions, and policies. And so being able to kind of jump onto that and say, here's, look, a lot of cities are doing things to address the transportation, electric, building sector, but the food sector is often left out, as we all know here. And so here's, an opportunity for the city to take action in line with its, commitment to addressing climate, the climate crisis. Here's something that you can do to help address the impact on the food from the food sector.
Thank you,
Did that
Alex.
answer your question? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Before we move on, I just wanted to remind everyone and anyone who wasn't here at the very beginning that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in the center to ask any questions, and we will try to get to them at the end. So perhaps one of the trickiest and least talked about components of this work is what occurs after a policy is passed to ensure its implementation. So Laura, you've helped see through the implementation of various city policies in cities like Denver, San Diego, with the Better Food Foundation. Can you explain some of the processes you've gone through and what has worked, and perhaps helpfully what hasn't worked for ensuring successful implementation?
Sure. Thank you so much. So I think a lot of what I'm going to say is going to overlap with what everyone else is saying on the panel. And I think that's because implementation really has to be thought of from the very beginning and throughout the entire process if you want that piece to be successful. So, when you're first going in and thinking about the policy and undertaking the steps that Alex was just talking about, you really should be thinking about what is it going to take for this to be implemented and really try to understand how that locality works, what their procurement even looks like, how much power do they have, or what is their jurisdiction over these different departments or institutions, because that varies so much. Like, a small city might not have any control over what's served in the food or in the schools, but the neighboring county or the larger county around it might have complete control over the schools. Some big cities like New York City can do a lot. They have an entire hospital system that's public, and I'm sure Rachel will be talking about that in a minute. So there's just such a variety of like levels of control that cities and counties have, and really understanding that, as well as how these institutions operate. Like, are they self-operated with food? Do they work with a giant food service provider like Sodexo or Airmark? Are there individual departments and offices that have meetings and can order their own food? So the more you can find out earlier, the better, so that you can be formulating that plan as you're going in. I think also, so a good example of, kind of what hasn't worked is we were working with San Diego City, and that example was really successful in terms of getting a policy passed. They committed to a reduction in their food and water footprints from food, which was really huge and really unprecedented for them. But unfortunately, San Diego City doesn't control a lot of food in their jurisdiction. The county actually controls a lot more. And so we kind of stalled out a little bit in trying to get wide scale implementation of this policy, versus just small scale like meetings and things, which is still a great step, but you kind of need to know what you're working with when going in. And then again, I think this has really already been stressed a lot, but having allies or somebody to spearhead the implementation inside the government is really critical. So again, like the New York City mayor's office, which I know Rachel will talk about, but that entire office is so on board with, making progress in this direction. So when our initiative that we incubated, that's now separated off into its own, blossomed into its own organization, but Greener by Default, when their team worked with New York City, they actually, already had that ally with the city, and then, getting the hospitals on board to implement this entire plant-based default program throughout the hospitals was a lot probably smoother than it could have gone if you don't have those allies and just face, sort of burdens all along or backlash all along the way. And another thing I think that is really important to consider, but this shouldn't deter you, but whether the policies you're passing are binding or not, because I think like when we've tried to go through climate action plans, for example, a lot of times those can have really lofty goals but aren't binding. And not that you shouldn't pursue those, because I think sometimes if a city is passing a climate action plan and is like really excited about it and really motivated, then they'll get those things done. But maybe if you aren't working with people who are as motivated, having a more binding policy could really kind of light more of a fire for the implementation to happen. So yeah, I think there's a lot of factors that go into it.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of things I think I was going to get to in my next question, which was about specifically the lessons you've learned when it comes to maintaining momentum and keeping cities on track. Feel free, if you feel like you already touched on that, can also combine it with more about how you measure progress and what the specific metrics for success kind of look like.
Yeah, definitely. So I think some of the same things still apply. Having a really friendly contact in the government is important. So, working with Washington, D.C., several years ago, they passed the Green Food Purchasing Act, and this set an emissions reduction target for their food. And that is a law now. So it's something they have to move forward with. But I think even when things are laws, it can be hard when so many different departments have so many different things going on. But there is somebody who works in the DC government who is overseeing this whole process, and having her as an ally and her, doing the follow-up work herself is amazing. And I think is keeping things moving along. Again, it's always hard, I think, when you're working with such a big city, but having that contact is important. Also, I think setting timelines are important instead of, leaving like a vague end goal, like having a year, or set points that you can check in. And if you can get an agreement in place, even like if you're working with an individual department that is going to be doing some sort of implementation, having them agree up front, this is what we're responsible for, this is what we're going to do. Also, we really love at Better Food Foundation to provide really easy strategies that can be used. Even if you don't have an official policy, they can actually be used. Just like departments can pick this up and use it for their own meals, or even individual institutions that might be run by a city. The idea is using plant-based defaults and nudges. So these are actually strategies that just rearrange how food is served, making plant-based the default or making it more prominent, which causes more people to pick those foods. It can actually increase the uptake of them by about 60 percentage points and reduce the carbon footprint of your food by about 40%. So just even going and providing these easy tools that are super simple to implement can like remove a lot of the resistance, especially if you present them as though we're adding options, we're giving people choice, we're not taking things away. And then lastly, I think just reiterating the point Alex made about having many diverse stakeholders, because, if you're working at a national group like ours and they only hear from you every once in a while, it's easy for officials to become disengaged. But when you're, working with community members who have a stake in this, they live in the community, they maybe even know these people personally, who work in the government. It's just so much more personal for them to feel that their communities are involved in this. So we've been trying to support local advocates around the country in their own communities as they continue to work with cities. We had the opportunity to work with Britty's organization on some of the progress in Austin, which is amazing. And their climate office is amazing. And now that climate office is taking their food plan and trying to get other departments throughout the city to adopt some of those plant forward, I think they call it pro health, pro climate strategies. And so it was really amazing to be brought into that, to also know that, there are local people like Britty's group, and we've also sort of activated some other local advocates who are now working directly with the climate office too. So they're able to show up to meetings, they're able to, continue that follow up and just be really the boots on the ground.
Thank you, Laura. I'd like to move on to a unique perspective, the city government side with Rachel. You worked inside local government for the city of New York to advance food policy for many years. How is working on the city government side different from the advocacy side when developing and implementing a city food policy? And are there any unique challenges that you faced?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. So my name is Rachel Atcheson, and I was the Deputy Director for the Mayor's Office of Food Policy in New York City, and now I'm leading Food Policy Pathways. In terms of sort of what is the difference between the outside and the inside, really the inside looks a ton at the data and removes a little bit of the passion, the sort of emotional pull that some of us on this call might feel towards this issue is really not represented at the table when we're making these decisions about what policies to implement. Instead, it's looking at either the public health data around chronic diseases, or it's looking at the sustainability data around either climate goals or other environmental resilience goals. And so really kind of having that really hardcore data approach. The second sort of major point is in government, everything is compromise, compromise, compromise. And so being very sure what is the end goal that we want and how do we best get there where everyone can be happy broadly. So our constituents are the ones that are eating these meals, depending on which meals we're talking about, schools, homeless shelters, jails. Sometimes it's their only meal of the day or only healthy meal of the day. And so we have to be very cognizant to represent them well, as there are, in New York City, 1 million school children that are eating these meals. So participation is very important, and making sure that the policy is not this idyllic notion, but is in practicality eaten. And so I think that is very, very crucial to be supportive of. In terms of other ways, working on the inside, you also have to get the others on the inside to be supportive. And so there are so many different departments and of government where you can gain allies. So I loved what Alex and Laura and others were saying about really building a big tent, making sure that you're building that broad coalition. That's not just a coalition on the outside. That coalition on the outside is important, but also the coalition on the inside. Is the press secretary supportive of the program so that you get proper news placement? Is the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice going to offer a supportive quote? Are they going to post this on their website? Are they going to supply you with the data that supports this initiative? Is the Department of Health going to supply you with its data? Is it going to offer support as well? And then in terms of sort of issues with promoting this, I'd say budgets are constantly something that we have to grapple with. And the good news is that for plant-based food policy, largely this can save money. And so it's something that really very excited for the folks on this call to really do some of those back of the envelope number crunching exercises, because we've found that it is a money saver at the end of the day, which is very beneficial to the main problem of government, which is a lack of funding. So I'll stop there.
Great. Rachel, you just launched a new nonprofit this year, Food Policy Pathways, to help develop food policy professionals. So I'm wondering what resources, skills, and knowledge you believe is really needed in city governments to affect good food policy and how you're building those through Food Policy Pathways.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is our goal at Food Policy Pathways to line the halls of government with competent staff to move this issue in a plant-forward direction. And so we are one-on-one coaching individuals who want to enter this field to move this needle, to apply for city, state, and federal government positions, whether that's internships, fellowships, or full-time roles. And so definitely looking forward to folks on this call who might be interested in pursuing that. Definitely get in touch and apply through our website. So we, in terms of the skills, a lot of the skills in government are learned on the job. It's definitely how I made my way through. And for me, it's the people. It's the people, the staff who are helpful and instrumental. I think we can all agree on this call that having staff on the inside will make a easier transition for a plant-forward food system. And so I think that the number one priority for our organization is to get as many folks on the inside thinking actively about this issue.
Thank you, Rachel. I'd like to open the floor now to all the panelists so we can answer some questions related to the best practices you all have learned and collected over the years. With that said, my first question is, what are some of the best tactics or lessons you've learned for getting effective food policies in cities? And anyone can feel free to jump in.
Happy to jump in. I can think of a lot, but I'll stick with maybe two. Let's see. I guess one thing I would say is and this touches a little bit, I think, Laura, on what you had mentioned about like what you ran into in San Diego with having like getting really strong language in the climate action plan, but then, you know, bumping up against obstacles because the city itself doesn't purchase a ton of food like the county does. So typically, at least with Mercy for Animals and the coalitions that we work within, we're advocating for, you know, or pursuing a legislative vehicle to get a city or county or state to purchase more plant-based foods. But I will say, if you are in a city whose climate action plan or sustainability plan, it might be called something else depending on where you live, doesn't mention food at all, I still think it's very worthwhile to engage in the plan, because as many of you know, with a climate action plan, it's very much a community-driven vehicle. Not every policy that a city passes, you know, are as many constituents who live in that city brought in and questioned and everything like that. So for us, one of the indicators of whether we could be successful with a more traditional policy is, you know, does the city's climate action plan connect the dots between the impact that the food system has on the environment and the climate? And so it could just be very, you know, a simple connection, or if you're fortunate enough to have, you know, like Los Angeles County, where they explicitly recognize in their county sustainability plan where it says, you know, to address the food sector's impact on our climate, we must purchase more plant-based foods. And that's all it said. But if you can get even language as simple as that, not a specific policy, you know, requiring X, Y, and Z, but something like that into your climate action plan, I wholeheartedly believe that that's laying the necessary groundwork to later come back and build off of that onto a more, you know, binding, so to speak, policy, or more robust policy. So that's just one thing to consider about like your first entry point in, if your city doesn't already connect those dots in its climate action plan. And then I would say, and this is just about strategy, but one thing in my experience over the last couple of years engaging with a lot of cities is when we do bring up food, just in general, to a lawmaker or city official, food waste seems to be like the top, you know, thing that's of interest to them to address. So just keeping that in mind, like, so when we're crafting our draft, you know, bills or proposals and things like that, we're sure to highlight the connection between food waste and plant-based food procurement. So if you can just, again, it's a small thing, but it seems to, you know, it's important. I can think of like 5 or 6 conversations I've had with a mayor or, you know, a city council member or something like that, who says, oh, well, you know, our climate action plan talks about food waste. That's really where we want to like focus our energy when we're talking about food policy. So great, you know, you're prepared with those talking points and the resources and materials to explain like, oh, great, this is relevant. This food procurement policy will actually help, you know, reduce food waste for your city. So those are just 2 things.
Yeah, that's great. And if anyone else thinks of something ahead of, as I ask the next question, you can also answer the previous question, because this kind of goes in line with it. But I just wanted to make sure that if there are any city policymakers listening to this call, you know, what advice you might have specifically for those city officials interested in getting plant-based food policies, or what do you wish that they would know? And that kind of goes along with some of the lessons and best practices learned as well. Laura, if you'd like to jump in.
Yeah, I was just actually gonna jump off of something Alex said really quick, which the first point you made, Alex, which I love that you brought that up, because I kind of forgot to answer the question about how do you evaluate success. I was kind of trying to fit everything in all at once, but I think there are really 2 kind of purposes of this work. One is obviously affecting actual meals, changing large volumes of meals so that, you know, you reduce these climate impacts. But the other is less quantifiable, and I think it's more about the sort of norm shift that we're trying to achieve to normalize the idea that plant-based foods are more sustainable and more resilient for communities, and that our leaders can kind of set this example. And so when you're looking at non-binding policies, or even initiatives that might not even be a policy or might not affect actual meals, like we've done some partnerships with cities where we've worked with mayors to proclaim, you know, we've worked with Veganuary to proclaim January as Veganuary month in Baltimore. or getting the Washington, D.C. mayor to make a statement, like those are really useful because then you've gotten a huge leader of a city to say that we need a plant forward shift. And you can leverage that, like Alex was saying, for future commitments, and also to go to the media and get the public engaged and really help with that narrative change, that cultural shift. So I think both of those things are important to measure, and both of those approaches are important. And so, yeah, I don't know if this answers about best tactics, best practices, but I think just keeping in mind both of those approaches is important, and not thinking that, if you're not going to get actual meals changed, that it's not important, because you never know like what it could lead to.
Definitely. Yeah, that was great. And maybe Britty or Rachel would like to take on the question about what you would like city policy makers to know, or how they can be of most help in a situation like this where they're interested in this kind of policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start, I'd say utilize the resources that we are offering on this call. I think any one of us would be happy to have an offline conversation with you. And I think it is all about getting individuals at this point to start moving the needle on the inside. And so I think inertia is the most common route, and not moving the needle is sort of the default. And I'd really like to push any city officials who are on this call to really make that first step, whether that's convening your Department of Health and your Mayor's Office of Sustainability into a meeting and saying, hey, why aren't we talking about this conversation? What is the next best step we can take? I think everything is important. So feel free to utilize us on this call.
Thank you. Since we do have a few questions in the Q&A, I'd like to jump into that, and anyone can feel free to answer as well. If we aren't able to get to your question, or you'd rather ask it privately, you can also feel free to email any of us at the emails provided on the slide that you see there. But Jason says, how do you handle legislators or town councils who are resistant to taking a stand for plant-based food and against climate change and greenhouse gases for political reasons? And how will you change your techniques in light of the president's new executive order targeting state laws that address climate change and greenhouse gases?
Yeah, I want to jump in here and say that this issue is a bipartisan issue. The effects of our food system are felt everywhere in urban districts and rural districts for different reasons. And so this is not a left issue. And so, just to be clear, there is a lot of momentum in Republican districts for moving the needle on food policy in this direction as well. And it should not be seen as just on the political left. Some of it might need to be altering our language and how we talk about this issue. But it is definitely an issue that is felt by everyone.
Aaron said, "Oh yeah, go ahead."
Oh, I'll just add really quick. I've always loved this example. It's from years ago, but I just love it so much. There was a mayor in a small town in Texas called Marshall, Texas, who had a cancer diagnosis, and so he actually took on a plant-based diet to help support his health during that time. And it became so like exciting for the town that they had this big vegan festival, and it was all about health though, and it was all about celebrating the benefits there. And I'm not as familiar with Texas. I'm in Virginia, but I think the politics there are probably very different from San Diego, where we've worked. But I think that because this felt like a community effort, that it didn't have to be this leftist left-wing thing for them. It could be something that they celebrated. And I also think emphasizing that this doesn't have to be restrictive, that it's really inclusive, and we're not taking away your hamburgers, we're not taking away meat, we're just providing more options for people, is a really important message too.
It's a great story, thank you. Aaron says, great and inspiring success stories involved with leading cities. Many cities aren't there yet and don't understand why they should work with sustainable food. Sustainable/plant-based diets is an even more sensitive topic, which some cities see as going too far and or outside their scope of responsibility. What are the best practices to get cities enthused about working with food?
I'll start by saying that it is a city's responsibility to take care of its constituents. And that goes for solving the chronic disease healthcare crisis that we're in. That goes for solving sort of planetary health problems that we're experiencing as well. And so just to reiterate that sometimes the work starts small, whether it is getting all the advocates for this into a small group and saying, okay, how do we strategize to move this forward? It can be as small as a 2 or 3 person meeting before it grows. But there is a responsibility that city government has to its constituents. And if you can frame this to match their goals, which is possible depending on what they have written about their public health goals, do they want to solve the chronic disease crisis? If so, good news, plant forward food procurement can help you do that. So there's a lot of ways in which you can get there, and definitely don't want to I think while it is sensitive, there are ways to push the needle forward.
Great. We have Eleanor from Canada. Love to hear what's going on up there. With respect to plant-based municipal motions, they've encountered that it will be more costly. She said, I just heard Rachel say you do cost analyses. Which calculators do you use? And is it a very detailed analysis?
So for the one that I had mentioned, Sodexo did the analysis that showed that it was 59 cents cheaper per plant-based meal that they were serving, because chickpeas are indeed cheaper than chicken. For the analysis with schools, the Office of Management and Budget has done some back of the envelope number crunching. So definitely encourage various folks to work with their Office of Management and Budgets to do said analysis, as that is indeed their job.
Looks like this question from Amy says, how do you suggest we determine which org is best situated to work in which city?
I can jump in. I think this is just might be a little repetitive of what I had said earlier, or what some of us have said, but I think yeah, it's a really good question, but I think my answer would be it's not necessarily one org. Before like for Mercy for Animals, before we dive in and start pitching our policy, obviously we want to be cognizant of who else is actually working. Is there another group working on this type of policy in the space, so we're not disrupting any of that work? But I think, Amy, I know you know this, but the most like valuable players are going to be the constituents there. So yeah, just making sure that there is organized coordination there, and that constituents, individuals on the ground, are brought in from the start and are part of the strategy conversations. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but and also if any of my co-panelists have anything to add to that, but yeah.
Yeah, and just another reminder that we'll be sending a follow-up email, so any questions we don't get to, and if you need more clarification on the question that you asked, I think everyone here is very willing to have those conversations. So Elena says, what have you found to be the most effective strategies to combat myths and misinformation put forth by oppositional organizations that have a vested interest in stalling plant-based policies?
I can kick us off. Most effective strategies. So I guess I'll say 2 things, but I know that there's more. One, I think, would be, so I can think of actually a very recent example where we're working on a bill that again would require plant-based meals to be the default at county-sponsored events and meetings. So preserving freedom of choice, but essentially having the county government purchase more sustainable plant-based foods. And we met with an office who was not our bill sponsor's office, who had some questions and potential concerns from various stakeholders who live in their district. And so aside from getting on a call with them and actually addressing those things, that's when going back to the coalition piece of this and the importance of various stakeholders having their area of expertise, we were able to bring, like, this happened to have to do with like a public health question. So we brought in our partners who work for a public health advocacy organization. And we also had a sign-on letter for physicians who were in support of this policy. So having tools like that to kind of myth bust questions around, the health, for example, of plant-based foods is really helpful. And then also just as that advocacy partner, being willing to like draft out, a short, concise response for your legislator, your bill champion, to be able to respond to any kind of those questions. So we typically will, almost every time we work on a legislative campaign, create like a myth busting 2-page document, and outlining all of the questions that we might get well in advance of a hearing or something like that. But they're pretty much the same, the same misinformation or myths that are put out there by opposition. So we're able to address all of those. And of course, always citing to reputable sources and making sure that we have evidence to back up our claims.
I would also just add on top of that really quickly that messaging and framing are always really important, and just basic things like the language you use. In Austin, for example, in their food plan, they don't really talk about plant-based food. They talk about pro-climate, pro-health food, which I may have said before, but that's what they mean is plant-based. But I think, Texas is very heavy with ranchers. And so they're trying to use language that resonates with people, because how do you argue against pro-health food? Another thing is, when we're working on plant-based defaults, we really try to emphasize, again, that this isn't like mandatory to pick a veggie burger instead of a meat burger. Like, nobody's being forced to do that, because I think that is really a trigger for a lot of that misinformation, is when the myth comes out that these policies are meant to force people to change what they eat. And so we work really carefully on our messaging and, the points we use when we're talking to the public, especially about this, because, we want to make it clear that this is, adding choices. It's making choices easier. It's making climate friendly eating easier. And again, not taking anything away.
Leah, I wanted to give one other example real quick, if that's okay. I know we're almost at time. So in case it's helpful, like one myth that we encounter almost every time when dealing, when advocating for plant-based food procurement policies is the local procurement myth. And we do hear this from environmental groups or stakeholders as well. And so it does take some time, and this comes with that trust building and making sure you're in a point where you can relay this information and it's actually heard and, it's not taken the wrong way, but addressing the local procurement myth. So I know many of us are aware of this, but local food procurement has a very minimal impact on food-related emissions. Transportation typically accounts for less than 1%, for example, of beef's greenhouse gas emissions. So it can be helpful to, this is definitely one of those myths that we almost always have to myth bust, to highlight that, when you're looking at the scope of food-related emissions, the type of food matters a lot more than, where you're purchasing from as far as locality. So just wanted to give that as an example of one of the myths that's often out there that we have to address.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Earlier. Oh, sorry. Sorry, everyone's answered so well, so I haven't jumped in, but I just wanted to underline what Alex said, is that like, it's not, for us at least, it's really not that we're myth busting these like big, well-known issues with GHGs and food. Our job is kind of to challenge what might already be in a plan and what city officials might already think is enough. And so that's really where the work is, for us at least, is to convince them that there's actually more that can be done.
Thank you so much. I just want to note that I am copying and pasting any of the questions that we didn't get to from the Q&A, so hopefully I will try to get those questions answered for you at a later date. But that about does it for our time today and concludes our webinar. So just be on a lookout for a follow-up email from the center that will include our contact information, resources, and a link to the webinar recording. And I just want to say thank you again so much to our panelists and to everyone for attending. Have a good day.